do that all the time.
We'll give it a couple of minutes for folks to arrive. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I thought we could start while people are still drifting in. And for the next 5 minutes or so, while we wait for folks, we can go around and introduce ourselves. And we may not get to everyone, but those of us who showed up early get the great privilege of letting our special guests, Laurel and Ben, know who we are. You all know me, I think. I'm Sarah Schumann. I fish in Rhode Island and Bristol Bay, Alaska as a deckhand on gillnet vessels. And about a year ago, teamed up with fellow fishermen to launch what has since become called the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign, which is a bi-coastal fisherman-led initiative to catalyze fisherman-led advocacy for climate solutions that work for our fisheries and not at their expense. Katie, would you like to tell us who you are?
Sure, yeah. Katie Almeida, and I'm a senior representative, government relations and sustainability down at the town dock in Narragansett, Rhode Island.
Thanks, Katie. Sorry, I've got a barking dog in the background. Jim, do you have a minute to let us know who you are?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Jim Kendall from New Bedford Seafood Consulting here in New Bedford, Mass. I guess some of you know me, probably met a lot of you before, but it's always good to see you again. Katie and I were just talking about how great this is, being able to converse with people from all over through using the webinars and processes like that. So you meet people and are able to attend meetings that you would never be able to make, you know, in any other way. So I'm a big advocate for that, and I hope everybody else jumps on board and gets all these various everyday meetings, because you can have 10 meetings a day and you know, get stretched kind of thin. But with the webinar capabilities now, there's no reason, no excuse that it shouldn't be part of the public meeting process. So that's my spiel for today. Thanks.
Thanks for that thought, Jim. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Laura Diedrich. I'm with NOAA Fisheries. I'm the external affairs lead for the Office of Communications, providing a lot of support to our leadership team. I had the pleasure of meeting Sarah initially through her work on the Marine Fisheries Advisory Council. And I've really enjoyed learning about the network and the work you all are doing. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Hannah, would you like to let us know who you are?
Hi there, everyone. My name is Hannah Harrison. I'm an assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada. You can hear my dog dismembering a toy fish in the background, sorry. I am also a co-I on the AgriFish project, which is a federally funded project here in Canada interested in bridging some of the challenges we see to food systems between traditional agriculture and seafood. So I'm really excited. I was really thrilled to see this come up in my inbox, and delighted to hear all of the information presented today. Thanks.
Thank you for joining, Hannah. Nikki, your turn.
Hello, everyone. I am Nikki Cunhal-Cabos. I am from the County of Kauai Office of Economic Development. I serve as the agriculture specialist and also work with our planning department on our climate adaptation plan. So I've sent out the call to several of our long-range planners to see if we can get them a little more informed and on board to finding the mutual wins for climate change action and agriculture adaptations.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Nikki. Fanny, am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes. Hi, I'm Fanny.
I am with the North American Marine Alliance and also Fishadelphia, which is a community-supported fishery in Philly. And I'm excited to learn more about this topic. Thank you for organizing.
Thanks for joining us. Sarah Marks.
Hello, I'm a student at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo, California, and working with the Bioresource and Agricultural Engineering Department to get more students involved in aquaculture and natural resources.
Welcome, Sarah. Jenny.
Oh, hi there. My name is Jenny Kester. I work with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife by leading their Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council. I'm really excited to chat more about climate change and its impact on fisheries. I was sent this link by one of the fishermen who's on my council, so excited.
Great. Welcome, Jenny. Davis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Davis Price, calling from Hawaii, work with Indian Collective, working with a number of Aina or land-based organizations who are focused on restoring our traditional Hawaiian food systems, really grounded in ancestral knowledge, or I guess as the field describes as traditional ecological knowledge model.
Cool. Sarah Caldwell, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I work for Fishwise and specifically on sustainable seafood solutions. And in the past, I worked more directly in with Oregon's fishing communities at a more local scale, and just across the board, very interested in catalyzing and moving towards more climate resilient fisheries. And from a Fishwise perspective, we're definitely interested in learning more and providing more of that climate lens on sustainable seafood production.
Thanks, Sarah. We'll do 3 more before we transition to the main course here. So we have Antonio, Melissa, and then Alyssa. Antonio, you're up.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. I'm Antonio Tovar, Senior Policy Associate at the National Family Farm Coalition, and we are very interested in the intersection between ocean and land. There's a lot of similarities, especially in terms of corporate consolidation and land grabbing, ocean grabbing. And we like, or at least we, their purpose is to be the voice of family farmers, ranchers, and fisherfolk.
Welcome, Antonio. Melissa?
Hi, everyone. Melissa Young. I'm the Director of Programs and Outreach with the Inland Ocean Coalition. We work on getting inland states involved in ocean conservation issues, and we're part of the Don't Cage Our Oceans Coalition. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Alyssa, your turn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa. I work at Fishwise as a project manager. One of my colleagues, Sarah, might have already introduced herself, but we are a nonprofit seafood consultancy and looking to work more in line with climate change in the oceans.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I said I would cut it off, but Andriana just joined us, so we'll have one more intro before we transition to introducing the speakers. Andriana, would you like to tell us who you are?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Andriana Natsoulas. I'm the campaign director with Don't Cage Our Oceans, and we are a nationwide coalition of organizations and businesses, including some who are on this call today. And we fight offshore fish farms through legislative and policy activities while uplifting sustainable aquaculture that's embedded in communities and value-based and sustainable wild-caught fisheries. Thanks for coordinating this.
Well, thank you everyone for taking a minute to introduce yourself and let us know what you're working on. Yep.
Yeah, I think we missed Ben for one thing. And secondly, I just want to use this diverse group of people here to go back over that same spiel I made a few minutes ago, pointing out how important it is to be able to have these webinar meetings rather than just strictly, in-person meetings, because we got people from all over the country here. And I hope everybody will jump on board and start pushing for all these entities to start having this type of coverage for these meetings. So that's my spiel again. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm going to give Laurel and Ben a big soapbox here in a minute. So that's why I didn't ask them to introduce themselves yet. But thank you, Jim, for bringing us back to why it's so wonderful to all gather. And this is the fourth in a webinar series that has been orchestrated this winter through the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign. And it's been so interesting that each one has attracted a completely different set of people. I think, Jim, you have been on most, if not all, of the webinars. So you've seen the same thing I did, that each one is completely different. So welcome to all of those of you who are new to this. So today we are joined by two guest speakers from the agricultural world who are going to help us identify common ground with our brethren of the soil. This webinar series is mostly oriented towards those who work the waters in a wild fish harvesting capacity. And we don't spend much time on land, but we're always wondering, what do those who till the soil, what are they dealing with? Is it the same as what we're dealing with? And what would it take to sort of build more of an alliance between the terrestrial and the marine sides of the food system? But before I introduce Ben and Laurel, I'd like to sort of paint a picture for them, because I assume that with most of their focus being on farms, they also have questions about what we on the water are grappling with. So I'd like to paint a picture of what we are grappling with. And I'm going to base this on the first of the webinars that we had in this series earlier in January, which was called Alaska and the Lower 48, Forging Common Cause Around Climate Impacts and Solutions. In that webinar, we heard from 6 speakers from Alaska, the West Coast, and New England. First, we heard a very compelling presentation by Jamie Gowan of the Alaska Bering Sea Crabbers, who gave us a vivid description of how the North Pacific crab fleet is currently contending with an unexpected full season shutdown of 2 of their most important crab fisheries. A closure that, according to scientists, is due at least in large part to changes related to water temperature. In Jamie's presentation, she teed up 3 core pillars of the response that her organization is working on. Number 1 is responding to the disaster through immediate economic relief to the fishermen. Number 2 is adapting to climate change by engaging the fleet and contributing to data collection that can help anticipate changes like this in the future and work towards more adaptive fisheries management. And number 3 that we can't lose sight of is to always work towards mitigating the root causes of climate change and ocean acidification. Next, we heard from Lori Steele of the West Coast Seafood Processors Association, who told us that fishermen are, of course, on the front lines of climate change, but that in the rush to find climate solutions, some approaches are being pushed forward, like industrial offshore wind, which may not be as green as they sometimes appear to be. And Lori advocated taking a look before you leap approach to climate solutions, and emphasized that anytime climate solutions are taking place in or near the marine environment, fishermen must have a seat at the table. Then we heard from Chris Brown, who fishes in Rhode Island. And he opened up and told us what's been on the inside of his mind for the last several years is the question, what's going to get me first, climate change or the solutions to it? And he was also, like Lori, referring to offshore wind, but he said that offshore wind is just the beginning, and that in the not too distant future, we can expect to see more and more pressure being placed on the oceans to solve the climate crisis in different ways. Then we heard from Melanie Brown, who's an Alaska setnet fisherman in Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay is also where I fish, and we've been lucky in the last few years that it's emerged as something of a climate winner, where the sockeye run is doing very well, for the time being at least. And even though places like Bristol Bay are thousands of miles away from the nearest offshore wind farm, Melanie pointed out that this region too is positioned to be in the crosshairs of the green growth economy, with more and more pressure being placed on opening wild areas like the Bristol Bay watershed to extract the minerals that are purportedly needed for mass deployment of some renewable and electrification technologies. And second to last, we heard from Mike Conroy from the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, which is a national organization led by fishermen and fishing companies that emerged to help contend with the fast-paced development of offshore wind and ensure that it is carried out in a way that is respectful of ocean ecosystems and those who depend on them. He recalled that decades ago, hydroelectric dams were seen as the shiny penny. And of course, we all know what happened to fish runs as a result of damming of the rivers that they depend on. And he cautioned us against repeating the mistakes of the past. And then finally, we heard from David Gaithel, who's a retired New Hampshire fisherman, who also echoed some of the things we'd heard from previous speakers by saying that his concerns about climate change are dwarfed by his concerns about some of the solutions being proposed to combat it. When it comes to offshore wind, he said that some of the potential ecological impacts may be subtle, but they're dangerous, and that we need to not do what Europe did, which was to build first and study later. So that's sort of a snapshot for all of you on what's top of mind for those of us who are harvesting wild seafood in the marine environment. And for the rest of this webinar, we're going to turn our attention from the sea to the land in hopes of learning from some experts in terrestrial food production on what farmers are contending with as a result of both climate change and some of the solutions that are being proposed to combat it in and around farmland. We'll hear from Ben Lilliston, who's the Director of Rural Strategies and Climate Change at IATP, which is the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, based in Minneapolis. In this role, Ben analyzes and writes about the intersection of climate change, agriculture, and trade policy. He works with Midwest, national, and international partners to build a policy framework for a just transition for farmers and rural communities in responding to the climate crisis. We'll also hear from Laurel Marcus, who's the founder and director of Fish Friendly Farming, an organization that manages 2 voluntary certification programs for agricultural properties. The Fish Friendly Farming certification, which is awarded to farms that are managed to restore fish and wildlife habitat and improve water quality, and the newer Climate Adaptation certification, which promotes climate-friendly farming practices by working with farmers to develop custom farm plans to lower greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon. So I'm opening the floor now to Ben and to Laurel, we'll have 2 rounds of questions followed by a big group discussion at the end. So for the first part, I've suggested as a prompt that they can think about the question, in what ways do decarbonization solutions intersect with and impact farmland, food production, and the lives of farmers? Which technologies or approaches are fishermen, or sorry, I'm so used to talking about fishermen. What technologies and approaches are farmers for? And which, if any, may be considered, quote, false solutions? So Ben and Laurel, we didn't talk about which order we would do this in. Should we flip a coin or? Laurel, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can start. And I actually was hoping you said I could show a couple slides.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Does that work? So
yes, but I'm so bad at the, okay.
You just have to go down to share screen and say multiple people can do it. Does that work?
Yeah, I just did it. So.
Okay.
Okay. Let me know if that.
Well, let me start out by answering the first question because the slides are for the second. So one of the things that farmers deal in is soil. Okay, that's their livelihood. And they're probably the only people with an economic interest in soil health, keeping erosion from occurring, all those kind of things. They often do use tillage because this is an ancient practice to deal with, say, weeds. Like if you buy organic produce, it's almost certainly using lots of tillage because they don't have an herbicide that works very well. So tillage is kind of a problem when you get into the climate situation, because one of the areas of the earth that can sequester a lot of carbon is the actual soil up to a certain point. So if you go out and you start measuring it in places like forests or grasslands or something like that, carbon will build up to a certain point and then it'll reach an equilibrium with the atmosphere. Well, farmland is seen as the next big place that we can hide carbon and take it out of the atmosphere. And so the farmers have a lot of pressure on them to do this. But one of the reasons that they get a little nervous about it is, and I'm sure anyone who fishes can relate to this, they really do not want the bureaucrats telling them what to do. They already tell them what to do on just about everything. And telling them how to farm is kind of an insulting gesture on the part of the government. So that's how we got involved in doing these climate adaptation certifications, because there was such an interest in what can I do for the climate, but also an interest in I have to still raise a crop and make a living, that they wanted to have a flexible program. Most of the advocacy is around stopping all tillage and using cover crops, reducing the use of mineral nitrogen and instead using compost. So a lot of those practices fit for certain years and certain crops, but a lot of them don't. Compost is much more expensive than mineral nitrogen. And, you know, where do we get the money for that? They can plant hedgerows, they can plant lots of natural vegetation. All of those things count, but they still, I really think, feel this pressure by many urban people that they're the big source of the problem. And urban people, I mean, what are they doing? They don't do anything. Maybe they buy an electric car, but they're certainly not expected to provide climate solutions the way the farmers are expected to. So it's an interesting kind of double-edged sword for them. And I work with thousands of farmers and ranchers. So I hear a lot of opinions and ideas. So when you say, you know, how does this intersect? You have to have a really detailed and really fully developed program to make sure that you're protecting the right of the farmer to farm and produce a crop and stay in business, but you're also quantifying and actually documenting the carbon that they can sequester. Now, do you want to show, should I show a few pictures or what do you think? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, is everyone seeing that? Yeah. All right, so I just put like, I don't know, 5 or 6 pictures in here. So the other program I run is called Fish Friendly Farming. My background is as a restoration ecologist, and I studied salmon in California's North Coast watersheds in the late 1970s. So I am very aware of the problems that these fish face and, you know, how many different endangered species we have. So when we built the Fish Friendly Farming program, which has over 200,000 acres in it now, we had to build it around making sure the farms allowed each step in the life cycle of these anadromous fish to be carried out and that they can, you know, migrate in, reproduce successfully, and their young can migrate back out. This is just an example of vineyards that we have in the program. We also certify all sorts of orchards and field crops and lots of other people. This is just some of the wine brands. Okay, so now here's the climate program. All right, so California has the strictest climate laws in the country and a great interest in dealing with reducing greenhouse gases through natural processes. If you look at this little diagram here, agriculture is only 8% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in California. It comes mostly from livestock because they produce methane. They use diesel in their equipment. And then of course, fertilizer use produces nitrous oxide, which is the most powerful greenhouse gas. However, as I said, agriculture has this great capacity to sequester carbon. So there's a lot of interest in them doing that. Now, well, what we do is we use the most sophisticated model that exists Comet Farm. It was developed by the USDA in Colorado State, and it follows everything going on the farm to figure out what practices will give you the most carbon sequestration. And this is what really is a great advantage to the farmer, because then they can say, okay, well, that field, I can't do those practices there, but over there I can. And it presents it by soil type, and it's a very great tool. Unfortunately, 99% of the carbon plans that are done use this completely ridiculous model called Comet Planner. It's not site specific. It takes numerous counties in California and dumps them all together. And the numbers that you get are not meaningful. And this is what we do. We use all these different models so that it's a very thorough, complete look at the farm. It has long-term analysis, and it encourages them to put more riparian habitat on creeks, a big benefit for fish, more wetlands, and all these other things. Okay, that was that.
Thank you, Laurel. Ben, your turn.
Thanks. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me to this call. That's it's great to be here, and I expect to learn a lot. I don't know anything about fishing, so even though I live in, so our Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy is based in Minnesota. We have an office in Washington and also one in Berlin, Germany. So I'm in the land of 10,000 lakes. So I know a little bit about recreational fishing, but not commercial fishing at any level. ITP was formed during the farm crisis in the 80s. And so to really work with family farm organizations to understand some of the larger factors, a lot of them policy level at the national level and international level, but also markets and how they were impacting family farmers during that crisis, and what we could do to change that. So climate change has probably been an issue that has really risen a lot over the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years in the landscape around family farmers and rural communities broadly. I think the climate discussion has really evolved in those communities. I've seen it very directly about your ability to even talk about climate change to now, what can we do about it? How do we address it? In agriculture, I think Laurel mentioned some of this. The two biggest sources of emissions are around nitrogen fertilizer use and from large-scale animal agriculture, which produces a lot of methane, particularly ruminants. And our interpretation of the data and looking at it is also just how some of these large-scale operations store their manure is another. The manure itself, from both methane and nitrous oxide, is a major issue. We're in the Midwest. We have a lot of these really huge hog operations here. We don't have the size of the dairy operations that they have in California, but we got a lot of very big dairies here. And so I think it's, if you look at the EPA, they acknowledge that these are the biggest sources of emissions. And while nationally, it's a little bit more, but not much more than California's, it's around 10% of the nation's emissions. If you start to add in things around transportation and energy on the farm, those numbers go up a little bit more. And then if you think about the food system broadly, it's a little bigger, but we're gonna just talk about on the farm and agriculture and how it's affecting farmers. I'd say the number one thing for farmers right now talking about is adaptation. How do we adapt to climate change? And this drought has been very serious, affecting a lot of the Western states, but definitely coming into the Midwest. And just over the last several years, we've had extreme rain events, we've had hurricanes, we've had these winds. You may have heard Derico winds that no one has ever had going through Iowa. And so there's a lot of concern around that. And one of the interesting things about climate change is that some of the things, at least, that you would do to sort of think about adaptation to climate change are also things that can reduce emissions. And I think that's where there's a lot of interest, is where can we find these sort of win-win approaches. So obviously, you know, as Laurel mentioned, soil health, some of the conservation practices that she talked about are also things that farmers are interested in that can help them adapt to a changing climate. The more diverse your operation is in terms of what you're producing, the way you're holding on to water when you get extreme weather events, or the way that you can withstand drought, are all things that farmers are interested in. There's a sort of a very passionate group of farmers focusing on soil health, and there's soil health meetings around the country. There's soil health laws being passed in different states. And as mentioned, they are mostly voluntary approaches, right? These are not regulatory approaches, mostly voluntary. So you have that kind of movement and interest. But then I would say there's also really an industrial scale of agriculture. There's many different sizes, but the dominant system of agriculture is very industrial in the way it both raises animals and handles animals, and the way it treats row crops. And that system is focused on a few different types of technologies. One is biogas, which is to put basically digesters, big methane digesters, over manure pits in large scale operations that capture that methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, and then often pipes that methane into a natural gas pipeline. And so California has definitely been a driver in the expansion of biogas, but filtered out over many parts of the country. And so any pipeline that ends up in California can access a lot of the credits and financing that makes that system work. And from our perspective, there's a lot of problems with that technology. We feel like it creates strange incentives for farmers to produce more manure and to add more animals and get bigger. There's some evidence that it really mostly works because these are very expensive for really large scale operators. So there's some evidence that it's pushing towards more consolidation, particularly in the dairy sector. This is where you see a lot of this, although there is some in the hog sector as well. And then you still have enormous amounts of manure that have caused water pollution issues in large parts of the country where they have a lot of these large scale operations. And then there is a lot of pressure to reduce fertilizer use, and fertilizer prices have been very high over the last couple of years. So farmers in general are trying to do that. And a lot of that, again, has to do with what's called precision agriculture, looking at your field, figuring out how to apply fertilizer when you need it and not when you don't need it, at the right time, in the right place. And these kinds of things, and using equipment and high technology to be able to do that. But again, we're a little skeptical in that a lot of the technology has been around for a while, and we're still seeing rising fertilizer use. And most of that has to do with the expansion of corn in the country. And corn is very reliant on nitrogen fertilizer, particularly if you're growing corn on corn on corn, or so that means year after year you're growing it, or if you're just rotating it even with one crop sometimes. And so I guess I would say our larger kind of view on this is that there are different ways and different types of agriculture systems that can both reduce our methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And those have to do with, in the case of row crops, putting in more in different types of crops, so you aren't as reliant on nitrogen fertilizer. So longer rotations, which means you may plant 4 or 5 different crops over time to build, and other practices to strengthen your soil health. That can do a lot to reduce your nitrogen fertilizer use or need. In organic systems, you're not allowed to use that, and so you can. It can be done. The markets are really challenging for farmers to access, so there's an economic challenge that farmers are facing. And the same in animal production. And there's a lot of economic drivers. Sorry, I'll step back. There are different ways to raise animals, whether it's dairy or beef cattle on pasture that are less emitting and have the potential to sequester carbon more directly. The economic pressures on farmers are enormous, and there's a reason why we have the systems that we have. There's policy pressures, which we can talk about, that are driving them in that direction, the direction that exists right now. There's also market pressures. You know, a very small number of companies control most of these markets. So we really need to be thinking about how can we change the policy to create different types of incentives, and how can we shift the market so that when climate-friendly practices are introduced, and not only those that reduce emissions, but also those that help farmers adapt to the climate challenges. You know, how can we shift that? And that's what we're focused on. So I'll be quiet. Sorry if I talk too long.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Laurel. So the second prompt question for you touches on that topic of policy. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about what the advocacy landscape is around these issues right now, and what farmers are doing to organize, and what the objectives of any of their organizing might be in the short term. And Ben, if you want to start, since you were just talking about policy, go ahead.
Yeah, so the Farm Bill is coming up this year, and the Farm Bill at the national level, it's a 5-year piece of legislation. So it'll set farm policy for the next 5 years. It has to be renewed this year by September, although they can extend it. And that what the Farm Bill does is it's largely a public spending bill, and it sets up, well, what types of crops it's going to support farmers in case of both in weather as well as market conditions. So it creates a series of incentives to grow certain crops, particularly commodity crops, and that's like a corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, and those types of crops. And then it also has a whole conservation title, which focuses a lot on the practices that we've talked about that would make it more climate resilient and reduce emissions. There's a very high demand for those programs among farmers around the country. Current budgetary allocations for conservation do not meet the demand of farmers. In other words, many farmers are turned away when they apply to access these programs. I think our recent analysis showed something where 3 out of every 4 farmers are turned away and when they apply for these programs. So there's a big push to try to expand the pot for conservation programs. Again, these are voluntary programs, so sort of following on what Laurel mentioned, giving farmers a pathway who are ready to act and try to reduce their emissions and build their adaptation capacity. On March 6th through 8th, there is going to be a Farmers for Climate Response, I forget the title of it, but Farmers and Climate Change March in Washington, D.C. And there's going to be a lot of farmers who will be coming to town. It's organized by Farm Aid and National Sustainable Ag Coalition and a number of other groups to advocate for integrating climate change in the Farm Bill. And that's been one of the real challenges, is climate change has not been part of the Farm Bill traditionally. It's not been integrated into all the various components of the Farm Bill. So that's one area where there's just a lot of energy and focus in the near term. But there's other policies that are impacting farmers and will impact farmers. Energy policy. What is a renewable energy? And there's sort of a little bit of a fight about that. Is biogas going to be counted as a renewable energy? So really capturing methane from these large animal operations. If it is, that's yet another subsidy and another driver to get bigger and produce more manure. So that's a big part of the debate. You may have heard the Securities and Exchange Commission is now requiring or moving towards requiring companies to report on their greenhouse gases. And so when they submit their annual, reporting on their finances. And so if they do that, and what are they going to be required to report? Will it go down to include their full supply chains? Will it include farmers? So this is something that's being talked about a lot in the ag communities that we're in. And how will they account for those emissions? So there's a lot of that kind of debate, and how that plays out will affect the food system, I think. And we should know probably in April, I believe the SEC is going to come out with some of those new rules.
Thank you, Ben. Laurel, would you like to add anything on the topic of organizing around policy outcomes?
Sure. I don't work with the kind of giant operations that Ben's describing. I work with specialty crop growers. So California doesn't really get much in the way of these commodities. We have a few, but not the vast majority of what we grow is the fruits and vegetables that you all get to eat all the time. That's where, they come from California mostly. So a lot of those operations are smaller just by the definition of what they're doing. And by having these certifications, it does kind of organize people, because it's a marketing tool as well as a recognition tool. Because we have a very opinionated state where a lot of the environmental groups feel that farmers are a big problem. Like, we fight over water. We're just coming out of a very long drought, and the farmers were completely curtailed in the state. Okay, so you can't grow food without water. However, the urban people, they didn't really have any requirements. They were suggested to, reduce their water. So there's a lot of this sort of urban-rural friction here. So anytime we can do something that makes the farmer feel good about the sustainability practices they're using, the climate practices they're using, it gives them a talking point. They can do some PR around it. Anything like that is a really big deal here. And so by having these two certification programs, we've been able to get a group of people. We have workshops all the time for them on all these different subjects of water conservation, soil conservation, pesticides, what kind of pesticides they use, and climate. And I think this is kind of important, that because it's sort of a cultural issue. And, if you can touch the culture of farming and make people go, oh, I want to have that. My neighbor, he has one of those signs. I want one of those signs. What do I have to do to get that? And that's where we've been very successful. And I think that the climate program will do the same thing. We just started it about a year ago, so it's not been through quite the same number of years. Fishery farming's been around for over 20 years. The other thing I would say about, I liked the mention you made, Ben, of these big companies having to list their greenhouse gases. However, having been up to my neck in all the different kinds of modeling and practices that people use to determine greenhouse gases, you can do this in an afternoon and it'll be a number, but it's probably not accurate. And we see this a lot, these very simplistic approaches that are not accurate at all, just so they can market or mention whatever they have to do, some number. And there really needs to be a change and sort of like a adoption of best practices over how things get calculated. It's like greenwashing. Everybody was green not too many years ago, even when they weren't, right? So we want to avoid sort of marketing of false information by standardizing the way people are doing this. And there's a lot of scientists that are concerned about that particular thing. Let's see. The only other thing I would say is that farmers often go fishing. So they're actually, that's why our program's named Fish Friendly Farming, because they listed as endangered the steelhead, the coho salmon, the Chinook salmon in all of these places in California. And the farmers went, oh, they don't like that because they like to go fishing for those fish. Now, they're not commercial fishermen. They don't make their living that way, but they have a great deal of respect for fishermen as kind of, fellow resource-based industries. So I think that there can be some connections here between these different things. Ranchers, we also work with ranchers. They are kind of in that same group.
And that's a perfect segue to our discussion. Thank you, Laurel. We have a couple questions in the chat, but before I get to those, I want to kick off this group discussion around the title of this webinar, which is Fishermen, Farmers, and Climate Action. Are there opportunities for mutual wins? So if we can spend the rest of this webinar asking each other questions, and that means participants can ask questions of Laurel and Ben and Laurel, you can also ask questions from us to help inform yourself about what's going on in the fishing community. And ultimately, it'd be wonderful if we could come out of this, all of us, with a sense of where some promising areas are for collaboration between these two food producing communities. So I'll facilitate this discussion. If you want to speak, ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and I'll call on you in the order that you have raised it. And before we get to that, there are two people who've been asking some really good questions in the chat. So if we could start, Davis, if you'd like to read out your question. It's one I definitely have on my mind as well. So you have the floor, Davis.
Thank you, Sarah. Mahalo, or thank you for having us. I don't know, this invite was passed to me by Nikki, who works for one of the counties here in Hawaii. And I find this interesting. I just want to kind of introduce the framework behind the framing of the question. This topic is interesting because, obviously in Hawaii, we're very unique. We're the most isolated place on Earth as a small chain of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Traditionally, our fish producing communities were very closely intertwined with our food producing communities because of the vicinity between the land and the near shore resources. When you look at the vast landscape of the United States, policy that makes sense for the continental US oftentimes adversely impacts Hawaii. So to hear this conversation is actually a bit enlightening and promising, hearing that these two communities are being, discussed in unison. So that said, we face a lot of these challenges here. When we talk, some of the topics that have come up on this call with regard to energy production and, utilizing the ocean for energy production, it's utilizing the ocean for energy production and land. Windmills are something that have been contentious here. So renewable energies are a point of conflict and tension here. And so, yeah, just to give some brief background, sorry, I'll stop there. That's really the impetus of this question. I feel like, you know, if we can figure out how to produce food, preserve our ocean space to also produce food, and produce energy, you know, we're winning across the board. So I know that there's been some research that's been started around the area of agri-solar, which to me as a lay person seems very simple. We're building panels higher off the ground, so that you can grow food underneath and raise livestock underneath those panels. But I'm not sure what the obstacles are. So I just wanted to know if anybody on the call has any insight as to, you know, this hybrid use of land to produce energy and food.
I could make a little comment on that. We have lots of farms that have their own individual solar panels installed. Sometimes they even put them on top of their, you know, little square off-stream water storage area. So I don't know if that would work in Hawaii, but it definitely is a very common thing in California.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's solar. There's just growing interest in the Midwest farming community broadly. I think it's like the idea that you can create your own power. A lot of the operations are able to sell back into the grid, so they can actually make a little bit of money. A lot of the rural areas around here are co-ops, so they're part of rural electric co-ops, which traditionally have been kind of a barrier in getting renewable energy, but have sort of come around recently. So there's a lot of interest in, and like Laurel said, sometimes it's maybe on the land, sometimes it may be on the barn or on their on the farm. I was going to comment on the wind issue. That has large scale wind has been sort of a dual point of contention in many rural areas, and that is could be a point of common ground that we could maybe talk about, because in a lot of rural areas they're concerned about, one, this has just changed the whole landscape of our entire community to see these giant wind turbines. Two, often they're not getting the energy that's produced by that wind. It's going into a large grid that is going off to a big city somewhere. And three, they're not really getting the benefits even. Often these are outside companies, maybe global companies that are putting these in place. They may use workers to set it up, but then those workers are gone that kind of come in from out. So there's a lot of the debate is around how can we site these large scale wind sort of installations. There are parts of the country here that are really windy, so they're ideal. So they've already kind of, the industry sort of, here's the corridor where we need a lot of wind. How can we do it in a way that the people that live there actually get the benefits, and that they mitigate some of the downsides? I mean, you know, some of them, they used to be really loud. They've taken some steps to deal with that. They used to have a lot of flashing lights, which was very troubling for people who live really close to those operations. So that's a really interesting ongoing debate about how do we treat the people where we're putting these large scale operations, wind installations.
Thank you all. Noah, you have your hand up?
Yeah, hi there. What a fascinating discussion. I dropped a question for Laurel in the chat, but since we're short on time, I'd prefer to ask a different question of both of you. If you could just explain your opinions on the market side opportunities to incentivize good actors in such an extraordinarily crowded marketplace like food. and what examples of small producers successfully penetrating the complexity of that landscape?
Well, I can share with you what I know. One of the reasons we have a certification trademark is so it can be used on labels. The hard part is that consumers tend to not look at things like that. There's been a lot of studies on this. When consumers go to purchase different things and they look at the label, they won't necessarily recognize like, oh, this is a greener, more ecological based product. This is a climate beneficial product or something like that. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done for consumers on this. The other thing I would say is that in the case of specialty crops, one of the reasons that it's more expensive to grow them than they need to be is that they have to be picture perfect. They're beauty crops. So you have to use pesticides to do that. So when people complain about that, it's like, well, then buy all the apples with the spots on them, or buy secondhand produce, which there are outlets that do that. It's kind of unfortunate that more of the eco labeling, which was a big deal a number of years ago, hasn't really caught on with consumers. So that that's like this big gap that we need to address.
Yeah, I would just add, I totally agree with that. And in particular climate, I think, this is a relatively new issue for consumers, I think. And in thinking about your food from a climate perspective, like I think that's a relatively new, like 10 years, and that there isn't a strong sort of labeling, and that's where we need to figure out how to get to. Is you have to be able to differentiate yourself in the market, and how can we consumers reward farmers doing things a certain way. So for us, the organic market does have a lot of climate benefits, and it does have a certification process. It does have a label that's recognized, but it also has some problems. And not all farmers like to go through the organic certification, and it doesn't fit all farmers and producers. So there could perhaps be some improvements there in integrating climate, but I agree with that. And the other element I was just going to bring up that I'd be interested in hearing maybe from you guys is public procurement, and how that could be leveraged around food purchasing. So schools and public institutions, and there has been some work done to try to say we're going to give preference to certain types of food raised a certain way, or produced, for example, in Minnesota, we have a lot of like a certain amount you can purchase that has to be purchased locally, right? That's one requirement, or it's not really a hard requirement. There are incentives to do it. You get extra money if you want to do that. And I know some other school systems have looked at, other types of environmental benefits, maybe social benefits, treatment of workers, and so forth. And that seems like something that might be beneficial to both farmers and fisher folk, if we could align on, some common guidelines for something like that. Just throwing it out there as a possible.
Yeah, distance as a proxy for carbon, seems reasonable in the absence of anything more, detailed, the full, scope 2, scope 3 analysis. To be jargony for a minute, but so are there any discussions that you're aware of, Laurel, Ben, about attaching some sort of quantitative metrics around carbon emissions for production? I mean, that seems like if a common factor were to be identified, that would really present the best consumer choice in the climate context, it would be that, but staggeringly difficult, I'm sure.
Well, I kind of mentioned this, what model are you using? Are you using the model that was made for, 6th graders, or are you using the most sophisticated model that actually looks at all of the soil emissions? And that problem has not been addressed. So if you use the simple model, you get a number, but the number doesn't mean anything. So you have to have some standards on this stuff. And I have not seen any of this come from government or anybody. I work with a lot of scientific people in this field, and they're always grumping about this because they use the sophisticated modeling, and they do like life cycle analyses, and they go and measure the emissions that come out of soils when you do different practices and these kind of things. And so they're developing this really high-end information, and then the USDA programs are using this program that's silly. So we just have to get kind of all on the same page if you're going to start telling consumers something. Right? You can't have 5 different standards if you're going to tell consumers, oh, this does this. Well, does it really? I mean, it's the same thing that happened with a lot of the green, let's go green, and a lot of companies just sort of made stuff up. There was no standards.
Well, it is 2:00. Antonio, you posted a question in the chat. Would you like to ask that question before we wrap?
Yeah, during the pandemic,
Antonio, did you want to ask your question before we wrap up, or?
Sure. I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute myself, and
okay,
my mouse was not cooperating with me. So California, for sure, is the larger producer of fruits and vegetables, but also dairy. And dairy has a very high impact in the environment, not just on land, but on the sea. So something that many of us are looking at is to have some supply management for dairy, because there's a lot of milk. We are overproducing milk. And California is the leading producer of dairy. So I don't know, Laurel, if you are working with dairy producers, or if there will be some kind of policy that will reduce the impact of dairy.
Well, I don't work with dairy directly. I work with like beef ranchers and sheep and goat type folks. Yeah, my understanding of dairy is kind of limited. I don't know if there's still price supports on dairy or not, but there were for a long time. And I do know that a lot of people don't drink dairy milk anymore because we now have nut milks and all these other things. And of course, most of the nuts, like almonds, come from California as well. As far as like the environmental impacts of that, there's a lot of emphasis in California. Every farmer has to be, and this would include dairies, has to be within one of the water quality permits, where they often have to do a lot of monitoring. They have to, demonstrate that they aren't exporting pollution. Doesn't mean they always are able to do that, but a lot of dairies went out of business. I used to work over in the Marin County, West Marin County near Point Reyes, and we used to have lots of small family dairies there, but they couldn't afford putting in all the controls that are now required by the permits here. And, certainly there's federal controls, but we have a whole bunch of state controls too. So yeah, I don't know what to say about the supply though.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to wrap it up. But thank you so much to Ben and to Laurel for joining us today. Thank you to all of you. Most of you are new faces to me and to this webinar series. Really exciting to get a glimpse into to me, and I know for the rest of us on the call who are fishery people, a lot of this is probably new information, and I will definitely have to go and rewatch the recording to absorb it. And I hope that we can continue this conversation in the future, as we all have a lot to learn from each other, and possibly even some avenues for some mutual wins. So thank you to everyone for being here today. And you will receive a link to the recording once it's up.
Thank
Have a
you,
good one, everybody.
presenters. That was great. Thank you.
So, quick update where we are very close